This is the final project of Filip, Bjekic, Adrianne, Jessup, and Sage Santangelo on the J.R. Simplot Company. The J.R. Simplot Company was first founded in 1929 by 20-year-old John Richard Simplot. While the company originated here in Idaho, it has since grown tremendously. They have stayed here in Boise by having their headquarters located here instead of one of the other 7 plants across Idaho, Washington, North Dakota, and Arkansas. Although working with farmers to continue to lead innovation in farming and food processing, they are most known for the creation of the first viable frozen French fry. Some of you might not have even heard of Simplot before this, but I can assure you that you have at least tried their French fries once before. This huge accomplishment of a viable frozen French fry led Simplot to become the exclusive supplier of French fries to McDonald's and even other companies like Wendy's or Burger King. When dealing with a company that is as large as Simplot is, it is important for them to know the direction their company is headed. What will their revenue look like next year? In 5 years? What about 10 years? This is referred to as forecasting. Being able to forecast where their company might go if they continue with the trend we are seeing is important. This is because it can prepare them for what is to come. Preparing can include making decisions about the future of the company and looking into resources. Along with predicting revenue, we would like to see how Simplot is doing once inflation is taken out of the equation. A company can look profitable if they have high enough revenues, but that isn't always enough to keep up with the constant changes in inflation. In order for a business to continue its success, they need to be making money, and we intend to find out how inflation plays into their revenue. To answer our questions that were posed, we used 3 tests. First, we used forecasting to see what their future revenue could look like. Placing the data we found for J.R. Simplot into a table, we used Excel's Add a Trendline feature, which can also add in the equation that is used for forecasting. Using that equation, we forecasted data for the next 10 years and placed them into a graph that will be shown on the next slide. For inflation, we used the Consumer Price Index as provided each year by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Since Simplot is a food business, we used the unadjusted 12 months ended December of each year in the overall food category for the CPI for each year. For 2012, it was 1.8. 2013 CPI was 1.1. 2014, it was 3.4. 2015, it was 0.8. 2016 was a surprising negative 0.2. 2017 CPI was 1.6. 2018 had a CPI of 1.6 also. 2019 was 1.8. 2020 was a shocking 3.9, followed by a growth of 6.3 for 2021, which was followed more by a staggering 10.4 in 2022. 2023 is not complete yet. However, there is a comprehensive report for up through October of 2023, so we use that one and the CPI it provided of 3.3. These CPIs are important because to correct for inflation, we divide the revenue in each year by the value of the CPI for that year to get the index. To get our inflation-adjusted values, we divide the actual value of revenue by the index value and multiply by 100. Those inflation-adjusted values were then graphed as well, and you'll also see those on our next slide. For growth rate, we use the compound annual growth rate equation. Compound annual growth rate is found by dividing the final value by the beginning value and taking it to the power of 1 over t, where t is time in years, and then subtracting 1 from that. To see if growth was truly achieved after removing inflation, we used the compound annual growth rate equation on the recorded revenue and the inflation-adjusted values and compared the results. So we'll now go over the data. We found the yearly revenue for Simplot from 2012 to 2023 online, and using those numbers, we were able to create this first graph you're seeing. Using the graph, we were able to make a trend line and, more importantly, the trend line equation, which will be used to predict the future revenue. In this portion, we used the equation to predict the revenue of Simplot to 10 years from now. That is the second graph that you're seeing. We added our predicted revenue to the known revenue so you could see how it's supposed to continue to grow over the next 10 years. We also found the error and the absolute error. That way we would be able to calculate the MAD value. We can use these numbers to accept or reject potential null hypotheses that may come up in the future of the company if they want to do some problem solving when it comes to their revenue. This third graph is our inflation adjusted values. All those CPIs we discussed on the previous slide, This is where we divided them by the revenue to achieve our index that we then used in our inflation adjusted values equation to see what their revenue looks like without inflation. You can see more volatile peaks and dips, but that trend line is still in a general upward trend. This means that even when we take inflation out of the equation, they are still seeing an upward growth trend, which is important for a company. This is something that we confirmed with our compound annual growth rate equation, and we'll discuss that with our conclusions on the next slide. So our conclusions. We figured that we should expect to see the revenue for Simplot go up by 0.3143 billion or $314.3 million per year. This is based on the data from the previous years and the equation that we found. This means that Simplot's revenue has been steadily increasing by a lot of money over the years. Next year, they can predict to see an $8.77 billion in revenue. In 5 years, we predict that they will see around $10.02 billion in revenue for the year and an expected $11.6 billion in 10 years. The MAD we calculated was 0.773, and the actual trendline equation is y equals 0.3143x plus 4.6818. But to get an accurate depiction of how much the company is actually growing, we have to compensate for that inflation. As discussed on the last slide, we used the compound annual growth rate equation to compare the differences in the revenue and the inflation adjusted values. The compound annual growth rate for revenue was 0.045, and for the inflation adjusted values, it was 0.052. So we actually can see a more positive net growth in the company when the inflation is removed from the data, which is a good thing for the future of Simplot. So where does Simplot go from here? Well, to us, it looks like they're headed in the right direction. They're looking at a positive trend, and which means they can predict their revenue and it'll continue to increase each year. To ensure that their revenue continues to rise, we do have 3 recommendations for Simplot. The first is implementing new networking techniques. A company as large as Simplot doesn't need to worry about marketing as much as smaller companies do, especially since they're a business-to-business company, which means they sell directly to other businesses, so they supply many other large companies. They also should consider networking with new companies in order to increase their sales, which would then increase their revenue. The second is to consider a change in price if expenses increase. In the world we live in, no one is a stranger to inflation. It seems although every year, prices continue to rise. If this is the case for Simplot as well, increasing prices slightly might be a good way to continue to have that revenue growth that they desire. The third option is factoring in inflation to see how the company is keeping up. Inflation can seem harmless if you're making money, but sometimes inflation can have a larger impact on how much money a company is really bringing in. It's really important to keep an eye on that inflation to know how it's actually affecting your company. All of these things can increase the revenue and follow that positive trend that we have predicted. So for the evaluation of this final project, we are supposed to discuss what worked and what didn't. How could it be improved and what could be done differently? I think this is going to be the hardest for our group to discuss. The point of this final project was to use a business connection that you have to work with the company and answer questions that they have. It was supposed to involve real-world data collection and discussion in a real-world environment and seeing how those reports could potentially affect a real-world business. However, we faced many difficulties in this area, from being unable to find a connection to having one, to having it fall through yet again, and then finding ourselves up against a deadline with no connection and no data. We turned to websites and research of a real company's data to provide us answers to questions. We all missed out on that real-world experience that I think would have really benefited our project. But with grit, we persevered to present a comprehensive discussion of Simplot and their yearly revenue that was publicly accessible online. So what worked? Us working together as a group to present anyway, and working hard to make sure that it comes out in a nice format. What didn't work? We're not sure what happened last minute, but our group member who had the connection dropped all contact with us the week of the presentation. How could it be improved? I know that I, for one, will be trying to make more connections with local business owners. You can't replace real-world experiences. What could be done differently? I'm not sure. What do you do when things fall through last minute? Persevere as best you can. And that is what we have done. Thank you.